Well, Kate, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and I can't believe you memorized those things. I am a little bit scared of what my student Sarah Olson had to say, but we'll talk about that later. Yeah, okay. I'm going to be talking today about how global environmental change, especially global climate change and land use change, looking at deforestation in the tropics, how that can affect disease, emergence, and resurgence. And, I didn't really pick today. Usually when I work on climate change and give a presentation, I arrange for hot weather, but something didn't go right with the forecast, but we're going to talk about that anyway. This crowd at UC Davis is well aware of this diagram that comes from the Institute of Medicine, the National Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine, their report on emerging microbial threats for the 21st century. And really what the idea here is that when we think about what we've learned from the medical model between microbial agents and human hosts, there's a lot going on here, but that's only part of the picture. And that unless we understand the socio-political background and the context, or genetic and biological susceptibility factors, that we're not going to have a real understanding of the underlying causes. And more challenging is the ecological factors that come into play when you think about infectious disease dynamics. And of course, physical environmental factors like climate is one in particular that I'm going to focus on. That really, when you think about infectious diseases, it's more than just the agent and humans. And of course, being in a place with the #1 ranked vet school for many decades, the idea that it's not just humans and vectors, that it's really a matter of wildlife too, wildlife and domestic animals, and this is where the One Health model comes from, and that's why I'm invited out here, thanks to the One Health Center for Excellence and the Wildlife Health Center here, Pat Conrad and Cheryl and Kate and others. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this One Health Frontiers in One Health seminar series. So this is a slide I don't need to talk about in this crowd, but the idea that you all know that the majority of new emerging diseases in humans stem from interaction with animals. And so unless we understand wildlife-human interactions and disease ecology in animals, we're never going to get to the determinants and understand how to prevent these diseases. The idea of links between ecosystems and human health and well-being is not a brand new issue. The idea of ecosystem services, how intact ecosystems provide services for human health and societal well-being, is something we've known ever since bakers in New York City realized they couldn't make bagels when they retired and moved to Florida. Does anyone know that story? So where are the best bagels in the country? New York City, right? Does anyone know why the bagels in New York are so good? Water, right. They had the foresight to protect the Catskills watershed, and they protected it from development. And so New York City gets this pristine water from the Catskills. They don't have these, chlorination facilities, and they get really good water. So when the bakers moved to Florida and they didn't have the good water, they couldn't make good bagels. So there's one ecosystem service. There's an example of an intact ecosystem providing clean water. So this whole idea of ecosystem services is not brand new, but it's now gaining some traction. This is just to tell you that this concept is reaching the highest levels. I've been involved with a report for the Executive Office of the President entitled Sustaining Environmental Capital, Protecting Society and the Economy. And in this This is not out yet. This is in draft right now. It was supposed to be released on Earth Day, but it's coming out soon. But this idea of how intact ecosystems can actually prevent disease is part of the story here. And it's being promoted at high levels. Now, how many of you have not seen this graph? You've all seen this graph. This is looking at past and future climate. The idea here is you can reconstruct climate. You can go back. This just goes back 1,000 years by looking at ice core samples and tree ring cores and ice and coral reef core boring. And you can reconstruct climate back actually 900,000 years. This only goes back 1,000 years and shows that we're, except for today, we are, except for May 16th, we are on average above 2 standard deviations of any temperature we've had in the last 1,000 years. And the projection is for rapid warming. Now, I'm not the climatologist, but this is what the climatologists have been showing us. And for any of you that work in disease ecology and infectious disease modeling, you understand that that could be quite problematic. Have we really seen a change globally? Well, this is an image of the North Pole, the Arctic sea ice coverage at the end of summer in 1980, and this is the end of summer in 2007. Now, I could stop right here, but I know this is a very smart audience, so I do want to make sure that I tell you this is not just cherry-picking one hot year, because that large extent of ice melt, about half the United States, is part of a trend. This is looking at sort of worst-case scenarios of how fast the Arctic will melt. This is from 1900 to 2100, showing when the ice will melt. That's the worst-case scenario. This is best-case scenario. But of course, what's the red line? That's reality. The red line is the observed speed of melting, and you can see that the observed melting rate is worse than worst-case scenario. So this is when the climate community said, hang on, we're really seeing a response to global warming, and got people worried. And especially, you saw covers like this to be worried about climate change, and the poor polar bear is going to go extinct as it loses its hunting grounds. But one of the subtitles was how it threatens your health, and this is the subject of the first part of this lecture on the health effects of climate change. And if you think about the physical attributes of climate change, these three issues of rising temperatures, sea level rise, mostly from thermal expansion of salt water. Forget about whether or not Greenland melts and goes into the ocean. If that happens, we're talking about 20 feet of sea level rise. But the United Nations is very conservative on this, and the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is only looking at sea level rise from warmer salt water, thermal expansion of salt water, and that's about a half a meter sea level rise. The other physical issue with climate change, it's not just warmer temperatures, it's extremes of the water cycle, the hydrologic extremes. Does anyone, well, I don't know about California, but when do you get your heaviest thunderstorms here? What month? January, February? All right, well then forget it. Never mind. Where I come from, our heaviest thunderstorms are in the hottest month, July, August, because hot air holds more moisture. So you can, the hot air evaporates soil moisture and you get droughts, but hot air holds more moisture. When it rains, it can rain really hard. That's why extremes at either end, extremes of the water cycle. So this can affect all sorts of different health outcomes. People die in heat waves, and if you've got sprawling asphalt, concrete cities that have these heat-retaining surfaces, you have the urban heat island effect. Ground level smog, ozone pollution is very temperature sensitive, and so is ragweed pollen, ragweed plants are temperature sensitive. I'm going to talk mostly for this crowd about the infectious diseases, mostly vector-borne or insect rodent-borne diseases, and waterborne diseases. And of course, food and water are the foundation of public health. So water resources, food supplies, if we're thinking about droughts or floods, these could be quite problematic. And on the bottom, the most difficult thing to study, forced environmental migration from environmental disasters, people being forced to move. Environmental refugees, that presents a huge public health burden. Very hard to disentangle political situation from environmental situation, but that could be a huge issue. So we'll go into a couple of these issues. This is a study that came out 2 years ago in the journal Science. Roz Naylor and Patz up at she's at Stanford and he is at the University of Washington. They asked the question, where will we see record temperatures for summertime? Where will we exceed record temperatures? And by the middle of this century, everything in orange or red has a 70% chance or greater probability of having a record temperature for the summertime. And by the end of the century, everything in red, greater than 90% probability of having extreme summer temperatures. Now, that has a lot of implications for food supplies. And today we have 800 million people already food insecure. This number, according to this model, would double because of crop failures by the middle of the century, which is not that far away. So this is one model looking at issues with hunger and malnutrition. But for those of you who are working in One Health and zoonotic diseases, this slide, which comes from that wonderful book of ours that you've got, Kate, I'm sure you have this page marked with this model, this diagram that shows what are the diseases most sensitive to climate or ecological, basically environmental change. Is it diseases that go from human to human, from one 98.6 degree environment to another 98.6 degree environment? There's not a lot of environmental influence there. So directly transmitted anthroponoses, human to human, that doesn't have a lot of environmental influence. Maybe some zoonoses where, like rabies, animals, there's some environmental influence. Actually, there is, but as far as being affected by climate, there's not so much. It's these indirectly transmitted, the vector-borne diseases, where you've got, outside of the humans, you've got vector agents like a mosquito or a tick, where there's more sensitivity to the environment. And if you've got an indirectly transmitted zoonotic disease, so vector-borne zoonotic disease like West Nile virus, Lyme disease, these involve climate and landscape. It gets very environmentally sensitive. So all the things that you guys are studying in the vet school and in the One Health Center for Excellence, those are the most environmentally sensitive diseases. So what's the difference between you and a mosquito? Besides that you can't fly. And I'm just looking around the room and I don't think any of you suck blood much. Maybe Bill Risen, I don't know.
We're warm-blooded.
We're warm-blooded and mosquitoes are cold-blooded. Exactly. What's your name?
Jenna.
Jenna. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Okay. So what does this mean? Cold-blooded mosquitoes, whatever the air temperature is around that mosquito, that's its body temperature. What if that mosquito is harboring malaria parasites or dengue fever virus or West Nile virus? The air temperature has a direct influence on the speed of development of the parasite virus or protozoa, whatever it is, in that mosquito. And this is a graph that we know very well. And Shirley, correct me if I'm wrong on this one, okay? But this is the life cycle inside the mosquito, the extrinsic incubation period. And this is for two of the main parasites that cause malaria in humans, Plasmodium vivax, Plasmodium falciparum. And notice what do these lines do when it gets, this is temperature, and the number of days that it takes the parasite to develop inside the mosquito. These days are indicating when that mosquito draws up, let's say I have malaria, it draws up my blood, the parasite crosses the mosquito's stomach lining and develops into an infective sporozoite stage in the salivary glands, so that the next time she bites another person, she passes malaria, transmits the disease. That's all time dependent, and the time that it takes to develop for that mosquito to become infectious is temperature sensitive. So at this end of the spectrum, if it gets below, say, 16 or 17 degrees for vivax, how long will it take that parasite to develop? What happens to that line? Becomes asymptotic, flattens out, right? So how long will it take? Forever, right? Okay, so it'll take forever for that parasite to develop. In other words, you can't have development of malaria if it's too cold. It's just biologically not suitable for this biological system. You cannot have malaria if you don't have enough warm degree days. You just can't have the disease. That's why malaria is a tropical disease. And of course, as the temperature increases, the mosquitoes become infectious much more quickly. Now, the counter force here is that if it gets really hot, mosquitoes don't survive as long. And, there's this equation, a vectorial capacity equation. It takes into consideration biting rates and how many mosquitoes and how long they live. And this development time, this is actually an exponential term in that equation. So this is very important. And so if you take a place like Zimbabwe that has high altitude, it has a highlands right in the middle of the country. And from what we know about this climate suitability for malaria transmission and thinking about that extrinsic incubation graph, it's the high plateau where most of the big cities are. These are these cold green and blue colors indicating low climate suitability for malaria. This is a model done by Dr. Chris Ebi and her team where they looked at climate suitability for malaria today and in the future. So with baseline climate, you got plenty of malaria down in the lowlands, but in the high plateau, low climate suitability for malaria. But what about 50 years from now? What will the climate be like? It will change so that those highlands, where it's too cold, becomes warm enough to support malaria. So this is where we're concerned that as climate changes, some of these tropical diseases may change in their distribution. And this is not to say that climate is everything. You absolutely need the right climate to have malaria. But drug resistance, human population migration, vector control, and infrastructure, all these things are extremely important. So whether or not, if this was Mexico, for example, and you're talking about a disease like dengue fever, will climate force dengue to move up into the United States? That's a totally different story. You're dealing with different economies. You already have the mosquitoes in both places. So it's a place like this where it's one country, one infrastructure. The shift in disease moving up in the highlands, it could be a real scenario. There have been some documented diseases in domestic animals. This is blue tongue virus, where Dr. David Rogers from Oxford University has been mapping, these different strains of virus moving northward in Europe, and he's looked at time series of climate, of temperatures over Europe, and I won't go into the details, but looking at various confounding factors, he concluded that there was a probable climate influence of gradual warming pushing this disease northward up in northern Europe. What about a disease here in the United States? West Nile virus. How many of you are working on West Nile virus? Wait a minute, just you guys? Okay, so you left your shop behind, huh? Okay. All right, well anyway, so those of you who are working on West Nile, you know that this is a disease that naturally cycles through mosquitoes and birds. So it's a zoonotic disease. This is its natural cycle. And horses and humans can become infected, get sick, and die. But we are irrelevant to the life cycle as dead-end hosts. But West Nile virus came into the United States in 1999. And it came into New York City, and then because it cycles in birds, it sort of went down the coast, and then it followed the bird migratory pathways. So it sort of percolated for a few years. It came down here, I don't know when it hit Florida, maybe 2001 or so. And then 2002, it was raging up through the Midwest. And then, not surprisingly, 2003 hit the Rockies. And then 2004, it hit California. Now, this migration, West Nile virus marching across the country, mostly from interacting with birds, the bird migration, that was pretty much expected. But what wasn't expected was the relationship to temperature. If you look back at where we've had the biggest West Nile virus outbreaks, there's always been some sort of either a drought conditions or a heat wave. You see drought or heat wave or mild winter, in every major outbreak. Now, in 1999, when West Nile came into New York City, that was the hottest July ever recorded in New York City. Did climate change have anything to do with West Nile coming to this country? Probably not. The story is, I think the genetics track West Nile virus back to the Middle East, and probably an infected bird, Bill, correct me if I'm wrong, infected mosquito or bird on a plane landed in New York. But the question is, were the conditions in New York with record temperatures in July, did that help West Nile grab a foothold on this continent? And I'll let Bill Risen and his team answer that question. I don't know the story, but it's a story of international transportation bringing the virus. But it seems like temperatures have something to do with it. And Professor Risen's work showed that the strain of West Nile virus in the United States, different from other strains of West Nile around the world, actually required warmer temperature than other strains. And even though I showed you the map of the bird migration and the West Nile in the east and the Midwest, and it kept moving across, within those expected regions of the country, Dr. Risen found that during those epidemic summers that there were hot spots. And these hot spots of transmission were linked to above average temperatures. This is from his paper showing that, in the Midwest, when you had it through the Midwest, there were places where there was more transmission. It happened to be hotter than average there. And the same in 2003. It was super hot. I was actually doing a mini sabbatical in Colorado, and it was the hottest summer. It was miserable. But that hot spot was where he had the most transmission. And in California, the same thing. So even though this is about international travel that brought West Nile here, it's about wildlife behavior and bird migration. That's the main driver for West Nile. There is also an exacerbating, maybe a synergistic effect of hot temperatures. And Bill Risen is coming out with a new paper, or is it already out, with your temperature even further validating the strength of a temperature relationship? Maybe I shouldn't have said that. I've just spilled the beans. Is anyone from the newspaper here? Just forget what I just said, okay? So we're talking a lot about temperature. Are there any climatologists in the room? Oh, good. All right, I can say anything then. So the climatologists say, stop calling it global warming. It's not just about temperatures. It's extremes of the water cycle. So it's flooding, it's droughts. That's part of the story. And here's a beautiful image of Niagara Falls. How many of you have been to Niagara Falls? Okay. Wow, that's a lot for California. Wow. So this is a beautiful picture of Niagara Falls, but I'm going to ruin the image right now because that is up there just to show you that the amount of sewage-contaminated stormwater that overflows in this country every year is over 1 trillion gallons, which would keep Niagara Falls running for 18 days. That's how poorly our developed country handles heavy rainfall and runoff. Our systems, a lot of our systems combine stormwater runoff with sewage, and then you get too much water. If it rains too hard, guess what? We're gonna overflow that, and we know we're gonna overflow it, but we can't handle that much water. We already have this problem all over the country with our current level of climate, our rainfall variability. We conducted a study looking at all reported waterborne disease outbreaks from 1948 to 1994 and found that 2/3, 67%, were preceded by extremely heavy rainfall months. So in the upper 80th percentile, and more than half in the upper 90th percentile. So we concluded that heavy rainfall is a risk for waterborne diseases, and this controlled for engineering failures and this was not recreational exposures, drinking water outbreaks. Well, this is a depressing slide. This is actually a very important graph. So just take a look at this for a second, and it's hard to understand, but this is showing the nature of rainfall. What type of rainfall is to be expected? And this is the global average, on average around the globe, average events, average rainfall events, a quarter of an inch a day or something like that. They're not going to change much. The light rain, very light drizzle will go down. It's the very heavy precipitation events that are projected to go up. Extremes of the water cycle, more droughts, but more floods, more heavier rainfall. That's the signature of climate change. This is the city of Milwaukee Bay after a heavy rainfall event. All that sediment that flushes out from the rivers into the harbor, where actually the drinking water intake is out there. Further out, don't worry, but there was a huge cryptosporidiosis outbreak in 1993 that we actually, in our analysis, was preceded by the heaviest rainfall month in the 50-year climate record that we studied. But since that outbreak, they've moved their water intake way out in Lake Michigan. But is this a dangerous thing? Well, our collaborator, Dr. McClellan at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, goes out in a research vessel and samples the water every time there's a heavy rainfall event. And this is supposed to be a flaming hot, you can't really see those numbers. This is 10 to 20,000 counts of E. coli, indicating contamination. So these flaming blue hot dots, you can see them here, you can see them on this beach. And the red hot dots, that's about up to almost 10,000 counts of E. coli right in here. But only 60 or 70 of them carry malaria, and only a couple of species can carry both of the parasites. And the main actor down there is Anopheles darlingi, so we're specifically looking for that species. And what we found was that the biting rates and the abundance of this mosquito, we didn't find many of the mosquitoes in the forested sites, but in the deforested sites we found a lot of these mosquitoes after controlling for human population. We sampled in abandoned agricultural fields that were completely deforested, no people anywhere, and we found this mosquito. So we found that we think that there's a habitat influence, that deforesting can really affect this mosquito, but we wanted to not only catch the adults, but ask the question, well, can we find mosquito larvae? Because mosquito larvae, they spend their lives in pools of water. So my graduate student and her team, she took her machete and bushwhacked through the jungle, sampling over 1,000 bodies of water that were encountered 5 times, and this is indicating like a deforested area where we captured adult mosquitoes, and then she bushwhacked through the jungle 1 kilometer on each side, transect, dipping for mosquito larvae, and this is a village site, that's a secondary forest site, and that's a relatively undisturbed site. And to ask the question, do we find that mosquito larvae in disturbed places versus in pristine places? That's one of her team members. Bottom line is that in places without this dangerous mosquito species, they tended to be more forested, where we found the mosquito, you saw a lot more shrubland and disturbed land. So in conclusion, what we know from this case study is that deforestation is associated with mosquito abundance, the dangerous one, Anopheles darlingi mosquito abundance. And we've subsequently, through Sarah Olson, who Kate mentioned, my other student, Sarah Olson, who is now working on the PREDICT project with UC Davis and Wildlife Conservation Society. Sarah Olson did a human epidemiology study in a county, a municipio or county in Brazil, and found a correlation between a history of deforestation and an increase in malaria. So we now have a human epidemiology side, an association between deforestation and human cases, and the entomological risk factor of disturbing the habitat and creating a risk for malaria. So we know this relationship. But what we don't know is the ecological mechanism. We don't know why we see this correlation. So the next steps are really to try to get at the mechanism by designing an adaptive field campaign, field studies that are supported by real-time spatial analysis of land use and land cover change. And really, this introduces part 2 of this talk, which is only going to be another 8 or 9 minutes, don't worry. But my first step in attacking this mechanism question is to hire a smart young scientist to work with me. And I found that person in Dr. Nico Preston, who is going to show you our next steps here. So hold your applause, because we're tag teaming this, and I'm going to introduce you Dr. Nico Preston. He has a PhD in ecology and has been working on this Healthscapes project to see if we can accelerate discovery and figure out all these environmental drivers and really put them together and use the computer age to deal with massive amounts of data and satellite images so that we can figure out the problem before the forest disappears. So, Nico?
Well, thank you, Jonathan. Thanks for having us here today. It's been a fantastic morning of meetings already. I'm going to give you a lightning talk here on Healthscapes, and it's only appropriate because the reason we're developing it is because of the sense of urgency. So this is a collaboration among ourselves, the Sahana Eden Disaster Management Platform, and the National Ocean Atmosphere Administration, who's developing an integrated disaster risk system using similar methods in a similar platform. And so one important thing to take from this slide is, thank you, just to grab my email address. If this along the way sounds like something you're interested in doing, we really need folks to work with us on this platform. We're just building the infrastructure. We need some help developing the science. So in a nutshell, what we're developing is a suite of web tools, the goal being to analyze, find, and share research data. The need for this platform is principally driven by urgency. So on one hand, there's lots of good science being done. On the other hand, habitat is being altered at a rate that we need to accelerate the pace at which we're doing this research. There are a lot of interesting web tools coming out of both commercial sectors, industry, universities, et cetera, that we think can help catalyze the speed of discovery. Among it all is a flood in both senses. One is a flood of data with increased sensors and sampling approaches and imagery. We're dealing with an abundance of data, and there's an opportunity to look to the IT sector for tools for dealing with big data. Similarly, in terms of disaster and flood, a lot of this change has been accompanied by arguably a higher frequency of disaster. So we've been working with the disaster management community who really don't have time to deal with formatting issues and other problems we often encounter in the scientific process. And so we've been taking our cue from them on how to do these things more quickly and how to iterate between sort of headquarters and the field. There's also a demand for transparency. So our community was stung a little by public scrutiny about our methods and approaches, and arguably a more open approach would benefit everybody. There's a lot of compelling reasons to work with what resembles a more open workflow, building on the work of each other, and not reproducing the same code snippets, et cetera, in each laboratory around the country. Among this urgency, there's also opportunity. So computing is slowly transitioning to lightweight clients. Just last week, Google announced their Chrome-based laptops. You can do a lot with just a connection to the web, and we want to leverage this to put more computing power in the hands of our partners in developing countries, but also resource-limited labs around the country, or just globally, getting things in the same space so people can have a lightweight client across machines to interact and collaborate with each other. One of the first challenges in finding this type of data is finding this type of data. The search engines largely target connections between websites. So if, for example, you're a malaria researcher and you need a base map, putting Amazon deforestation, file type shapefile could yield anything. It's a real challenge to find data that's relevant, that's current, and incorporate it into your analysis. In fact, finding the right base map data is arguably a bigger challenge than actually using it. And this is something being faced by the web development community. One approach we're taking is that instead of looking at the connections among websites to recommend resources, we're looking to the scientific literature. So we've been ingesting massive amounts of data, big data, and running large distributed compute processes to mine the data for connections between concepts. The reason we're doing this is if someone came to our site and was interested in malaria, we'd like to recommend a couple of maps they could get started with. So here we're leveraging that approach that makes you buy more stuff than you intended to buy on Amazon.com. Hey, people who like this book also like this book. If you like this map, your colleagues also like that map. So we're trying to leverage that mentality to connect researchers more quickly with relevant resources. Here we're talking about maps. We're using similar things for recommending code, results, analyses, tools, methods. Analyzing your data. We've got a challenge of a black box in our discipline. A lot of software one might like to use, you're not going to be able to buy off the shelf at Best Buy. So people are developing their own tools. We're running into problems sharing those tools. The same tools are being developed in the same labs. And some of the commercial offerings are so restrictive that you can't run your own analysis 10 years later, or you pay a license fee to teach a method you developed. So in that sense, we're intrigued by the potential of a more open workflow. And pulling a quote from computational linguistics, indeed, I think the scientific community is going to move towards analyses having to be as reproducible as your information management strategy. So when you say we're going to manage our data this way in our proposal, well, we're going to manage our analysis this way and release our results. So here's an example of how we envision someone in the field with their laptop interacting both with collective intelligence, so a community of people who developed these scripts and these methods together, as well as a panel of experts who have donated best practices. Here's some old analyses we use and we've published, and really they're just going to sit on a computer, so let's repurpose them in the community, as well as stuff we're drawing from the scientific literature with our data mining tools. So behind each of our maps, here we have an actual deforestation map in the Amazon. we have the underlying code. So if you're so inclined and are interested in such matters, you could look at the assumptions that went into generating that map. The other element that intrigues us is that of collective intelligence. Particularly in public health, the advantage of having people on the ground making casual observations can't be understated, whether for identifying a tiger mosquito or reporting an incidence of everyone's sick around me, et cetera. We want to tap that knowledge, both in terms of surveillance and raw science, to incorporate local expertise. Indeed, government has recognized that knowledge is widely dispersed, and through data.gov and other initiatives has been looking for ways that we can bring people into the dialogue. That person on Wikipedia with an eclectic interest in 18th century light bulbs, we want them. We want that kind of knowledge. People have lots of time to spend and can contribute to the scientific dialogue. The process of sharing this information, we think, will lead to a faster rate of discovery and building on the work of others. So sharing our analyses and code once we've established intellectual property, published, whatever the mechanism is. But there's a lot out there in the public domain that could be better organized and distributed and repurposed as a cross-cutting tool to other infectious diseases. Here's an example of our interface. We're releasing our alpha hopefully this week. We're on the road, so we're a little disrupted, but we have a mapping interface. We've incorporated both Python and R programming languages, so any script you can run in those with any library you can do on this. And then we're using a mashup, so instead of having another silo of knowledge about infectious disease, we're ingesting data from sources like Wikipedia to create sort of a portal of knowledge about the topic. So the closing slide from me, and then I'll let Jonathan say one last comment, is this idea that as a field scientist, working, for example, in the Amazon, it would be fantastic to have the power of a supercompute cloud back at the university where I could send a job back to run across 1,700 computers and process imagery. In order to accelerate the adaptive or sort of iterative research process. So I've designed my sampling protocol. Once I get to the ground, well, gee, it's a little different. How could I reprocess my results and adapt accordingly? So increasing the dialogue between the lab and the field, but then also bringing in these additional data sources and consulting with your institution and other experts. So snapshot of Healthscapes, please email me if you have more questions. Our interface isn't finished for getting in touch with us online, and I'll turn back over to Jonathan.
Stay up, because I only have 2 slides. Don't move. So anyway, I like that picture better. So I just want to wrap up by saying that a lot of this is very challenging work, but there are some great opportunities when you think about the combination of things we're studying: climate, environment, societal structure, and there are big challenges, and there are some great opportunities. Here's one example of where climate change and deforestation and health all come together. There's something in the negotiations about climate change called RED, and that's reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. So this is the idea that 20% of climate change comes from cutting the forest. They are CO2 sinks, absorbing CO2. So based on what I've shown you from some of our work about a link between malaria and deforestation, here's an idea that, well, gosh, can we mitigate climate change by protecting the forests, which can also have a health benefit? And this is where we in our center, the Center for Sustainability and the Global Environment, and now we have a new center, Institute for Global Health, where we're really only going forward with many disciplines at the table. We want to make sure that we're optimizing our outcome. When we do a policy intervention, can we have 3 or 4 wins versus 1 win and 2 losses? And so this is where we really need to be thinking across sectors, across disciplines. And with that, I will just remind you that One Health is a movement that is trying to do that, to bring, it's One Health is environment, animals, and humans. And there's also, parallel to One Health, is this International Association for Ecology and Health, that published a journal, One Health, EcoHealth, that we're hoping that One Health will then join us. And I invite all of you to the next biennial conference in Kunming, China. So mark your calendars for October 15th through 18th, 2012. So with that, thank you for your attention, and we'll stick around for questions. Societal well-being is something we've known ever since bakers in New York City realized they couldn't make bagels when they retired and moved to Florida. Does anyone know that story? So where are the best bagels in the country? New York City, right? Does anyone know why the bagels in New York are so good?
Water.
Water, right. They had the foresight to protect the Catskills watershed, and they protected it from development. And so New York City gets this pristine water from the Catskills. They don't have these, chlorination facilities, and they get really good water. So when the bakers moved to Florida and they didn't have the good water, they couldn't make good bagels. So there's one ecosystem service. There's an example of an intact ecosystem providing clean water. So this whole idea of ecosystem services is not brand new, but it's now gaining some traction. This is just to tell you that this concept is reaching the highest levels. I've been involved with a report for the executive and vectors, and it's really a matter of wildlife too, wildlife and domestic animals, and this is where the One Health model comes from, and that's why I'm invited out here, thanks to the One Health Center for Excellence and the Wildlife Health Center here, Pat Conrad and Cheryl and Kate and others. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this One Health Frontiers in One Health seminar series. So this is a slide I don't need to talk about in this crowd, but the idea that you all know that the majority of new emerging diseases in humans stem from interaction with animals. And so unless we understand wildlife-human interactions and disease ecology in animals, we're never going to get to the determinants and understand how to prevent these diseases. The idea of links between ecosystems and human health and well-being is not a brand new issue. The idea of ecosystem services, how intact ecosystems provide services for human health and society. Office of the President entitled Sustaining Environmental Capital, Protecting Society and the Economy. And in this is not out yet. This is in draft right now. It was supposed to be released on Earth Day, but it's coming out soon. But this idea of how intact ecosystems can actually prevent disease is part of the story here. And it's being promoted at high levels. Now, how many of you have not seen this graph? You've all seen this graph. This is looking at past and future climate. The idea here is you can reconstruct climate. You can go back. This just goes back 1,000 years by looking at ice core samples and tree ring cores and ice and coral reef core boring. And you can reconstruct climate back actually 900,000 years. This only goes back 1,000 years and shows that we're, except for today, we are, except for May 16th, we are on average above 2 standard deviations of any temperature. Well, Kate, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and I can't believe you memorized those things. I am a little bit scared to what my student Sarah Olson had to say, but we'll talk about that later. Yeah, okay. I'm going to be talking today about how global environmental change, especially global climate change and land use change, looking at deforestation in the tropics, how that can affect disease, emergence, and resurgence. And, I didn't really pick today. Usually when I work on climate change and give a presentation, I arrange for hot weather, but something didn't go right with the forecast, but we're going to talk about that anyway. This crowd at UC Davis is well aware of this diagram that comes from the Institute of Medicine, the National Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine, their report on emerging microbial threats for the 21st century. And really what the idea here is that when we think about what we've learned from the medical model between microbial agents and human hosts, there's a lot going on here, but that's only part of the picture. And that unless we understand the socio-political background and the context, or genetic and biological susceptibility factors, that we're not going to have a real understanding of the underlying causes. And more challenging is the ecological factors that come into play when you think about infectious disease dynamics. And of course, physical environmental factors like climate is one in particular that I'm going to focus on. That really, when you think about infectious diseases, it's more than just the agent and humans. And of course, being in a place with the #1 ranked vet school for many decades, the idea that it's not just humans